Our guest today is Professor Todd Jick. He needs no introduction, guys. You all know him. Many of you have already been his students, and I will honor him with a small introduction so that everyone, maybe someone who doesn't know him, gets to know him today. Professor Jick joined Columbia Business School in 2006. He is the senior lecturer in discipline and business and is a leading expert in leadership and organizational change. He's a two-time winner of the Singhvi Excellence in Teaching Award here at the business school, and he's had a long career of both academic and consulting work in this field. At Columbia Business School, he's built a pair of highly popular courses, organizational change and advanced organizational change, one of which I have also taken. I'm still taking it, and it's a very instructional course in terms of how leaders think through in times of crisis and in terms of change. So, Professor, welcome. We are very happy to see you today. We are very happy to hear your thoughts on the topic, and please tell us something about this virus. Is more of a leadership challenge as it is a business challenge. I am curious to understand on the big ideas on what should a leadership do and maybe absolutely not do in these uncertain times.
Well, Nishant, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and greetings to everyone. Many of you are currently taking my course. Some of you took it previously, and some of you are just checking this out, and I really appreciate that. I want to start by thanking Bernstein, and thank you, Nishant, for organizing this and being so diligent about it. It's appreciated from my end. I'm actually feeling quite humbled to be asked to do something like this on this topic of leadership and the pandemic, leadership and the crisis. It's certainly a critical subset of my own interest in organizational change. And so it is a topic, on the one hand, that's somewhat familiar, but in this particular circumstance, the magnitude of it and the urgency of it is obviously quite unique. That being said, I am going to try and take on questions that have been submitted ahead of time, and you'll take me through that in a moment, Nishant. But I'll start with what you were asking here at the outset and try and offer a bit of a way into this conversation, because how do we talk about the issue of leadership in these times? And I want to start with a definition that some of you have perhaps seen that I've used that sort of states the territory of what all this is about, which is that as a CEO once told me, leaders take organizations to places they otherwise wouldn't have gone to. And as I typically teach that in terms of change leadership, the premise of that is leaders have agency, leaders are taking initiative, and leaders are setting out to make some sort of planned change that they have, for the most part, control over. And so we talk about how to be able to do that, which is complex enough because of resistance and many other things that obviously are obstacles to doing that. I played with this title or this name, and I've changed it now to the following definition, which is that crises, in fact, take leaders to places they would not otherwise have gone to. And so leaders in this kind of circumstance are tested. It is a moment in which they are completely unprepared, in that there's nothing like this has ever happened before. And they are, as such, having to basically see whether they can rise to the occasion, and in fact manage through a crisis that they have no agency over, and that they are not planning for, and that they are not initiating per se. And that is the sort of framing of this conversation, is that some leaders will rise to that occasion, will rise to that circumstance, and some won't. Some organizations will rise to it, and some won't. And they will do so because this is nothing ordinary. And when we talk about something like this, we have to give it a name. And for some of you, you may know sort of the language of VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We talked about that in the advanced org change course, but it is making the point again that in a world in which many instances seemingly are coming at companies that were in these four words unprepared for, and therefore the ability to be agile, to respond, to be able to make up a playbook and innovate becomes an important leadership skill. So in some ways, this notion of a VUCA world has been well set out over the last 8 to 10 years. And I am one that is a proponent of asking leaders to consider that. And yet what I think we're facing now is VUCA cubed, If VUCA, in fact, originated from this sort of army that recognized that they were preparing for types of wars that did not, in fact, unfold, and they faced, in fact, very different kinds of circumstances. I spoke this week with General George Casey, from the original Chief of Staff and head of the U.S. Army, about his experience and said, is this not a different level of VUCA? So we may be establishing some new terminology before we're done. So leaders are going to be stretched in ways they've never encountered before. And that's part of what I think, Nishant, you were asking me about. And this audience certainly appreciates. By the way, this audience, I appreciate everybody being here today on this particular conversation live, and those of you that will come on the cloud later. But we all recognize that there's been a sort of anchor laid down by the Business Roundtable, which says when it comes to the way in which we're going to approach business and leadership, we're going to need to take into account many different stakeholders, not just shareholders. And so when you take a chart like this, which has all those multiple circles, and we have all the words that the Business Roundtable set out at the end of 2019, it's going to be put to the test now, particularly the part about employees. So we are talking about a balance of shareholders, customers, suppliers, the community, and employees. And my focus in this session is really about how leadership can guide employees through these turbulent times, and what kind of dilemmas and challenges occur for them. And the central one that Nishant and all of your questions asked me to talk about is layoffs. Layoffs and downsizing is a topic I've taught for many years, done a lot of research in. And so best practices about layoffs are well understood by me. But never have I seen the scale of what we're talking about now, and obviously the consequences. And again, many of your questions that we'll come to in a second that speak to the nuances of how to manage through this kind of circumstance that seems to be so uniquely situated in sort of a leadership history. Look at the scale of this. If you look at sort of a recent chart the Conference Board put out, the multitude of industries that are experiencing job losses is sensational. If you want to use a term that shouldn't have a positive connotation, it is huge. And there obviously has food services and drinking places at the top of this, but has many different areas. We were just talking about the performing arts. We have manufacturing here. You have many different layers of this. And not to be forgotten, there are some industries that are, in fact, succeeding and, in fact, having banner years under these circumstances, but they're few and far between at the bottom of this chart. But the purpose of this chart is to say the numbers of people that are being laid off by companies in some way, shape, or form is something we've never seen before in this scale. Now, when I, as a professor of leadership and change, put a chart up of numbers, it must be immediately followed by a reminder that we're talking about the people that are behind those numbers. You all can do all the spreadsheets and all the Excel analyses of the numbers and what was appropriate and what was not appropriate. And in fact, we often honor executives that are known for their ability to drive layoffs. Neutron Jack, the famous Jack Welch from GE, who died just last month, was renowned for this. And I want to just tell a quick story as we get into the subject of the people behind all this story of the pandemic. I taught the GE story for many years, and it was a debate in the class about all the benefits of what Jack Welch did in being Neutron Jack. The expression was he basically emptied his companies of people while keeping the buildings there, cleared out people. It was that surgical. And so these people were, in fact, cost centers for the organization, and the revenues and the profitability increased. I had a student, after the class was leaning very heavily towards lauding and praising Jack Welch, who raised her hand and said, before we get too far into this conversation, I just want to tell you about my father. My father worked at GE for 25 years. He was a loyal employee. He went in every day. And Jack Welch fired him. And his life was never the same. And his career was never the same. And all of a sudden, we had sort of the sobering reality that behind each of these numbers are people. And so the responsibility of leaders in this crisis period with this pandemic is all the more heightened because behind every one of those numbers and the multitude of numbers that I just showed you in the chart are all these people. So before I asked you to sort of, in your own, in perhaps your own experience and what you've heard from family and friends about how these have been handled, I want to make a sort of general observation about the theme of this talk. And that is that facing this downsizing and layoffs is a reality. It is obviously something that no one asked for and that the economy never forecast. But it can be handled in ways that make it easier on people, and it can be handled in ways that make it much more difficult. In other words, there's a leadership difference in being able to handle these situations that is a highly differentiating. And I imagine you have some ideas about what differentiates. That's what I want to share with you today, is some of these ideas. So that's my theme. What separates those that do this well from those that do it poorly? What does make for the difference? And I wonder whether you've heard for yourselves, and I'd ask you maybe to make a few comments on chat at this point. What are you hearing from friends or family or others about how companies are managing layoffs and furloughs in these COVID times, or places where you had worked? And give us a quick sense with a few headline words, how well it's being handled, or what sort of a theme of how it's handled, so we have a sense of what at least you're seeing out there. And if we can get a few of those chat bar comments, Nishant, maybe you'll keep an eye on it. I'll try and keep an eye on it, and then I might ask a couple of you to just talk a little bit about it. Sachil, you reminded me that in air transport, they actually saw an increase in job. Other places, abrupt but necessary. Looks like people are going to unemployment. Sometimes it's a 2-week furlough for employees, so it's a temporary period of time. Sudden, is it the first domino? Is there going to be much more happening? Promotions have gotten deferred. Bonuses have gotten deferred. Equity partners took a 25% pay cut. That's interesting to see that. Heartless, eliminating entire departments, on very short notice. What else have I got here? A couple of alumni have noted furloughing a third of the employees. A CEO said they've cut their own salary completely. That's certainly very interesting. This is a very interesting representation of the mix of approaches. And these, of course, are just quick headline comments. But I think, Nishant, I mean, did people not ask sort of how do you handle this well? Tell me what people were asking about this.
I know. So I have my personal experience for layoffs as well, because the industry that I was working in prior to coming to Columbia Business School went through a downturn in 2014, 2015. And I have seen some of these things that's being said here, in the sense that people's laptops were logged, people's Blackberries were taken, and there was just a note on their desk to come meet at the general manager's office, where they were handed the letter without any explanation of why those employees were getting laid off. So some of these were, and some of the questions I think want to explore as to how do you go ahead and instill a sense of fairness? How do you show authentic compassion? And at least in a scale like this, where you have to do it, where you have to lay off, let's say 2,000 employees over Zoom, how do you go ahead and show authentic compassion? Also, for people who are going to stay back in the organization, how do they build resilience? How do you go ahead and inspire them to continue doing their work and taking on more load during these times?
Well, I see Alex, your comment about some arbitrariness, or someone was asked to leave because her boss knew she had interviewed elsewhere. So you have people sort of being expedient about this. I think, Nishant, you're raising the bar on this on the question. So I have always examined what makes for best practices in terms of downsizing, and many of you know that I usually say about 25% are done well and 75% are done poorly. When it comes to downsizing, there are many horrible stories about it. But when we have those stories, it was pre-pandemic. It was pre-Zoom. And when you say now, we have companies that are trying to do this under the circumstance where there's no possibility of personal, any sort of personal meetups, which is one of the ingredients you would say probably would help make something like this go better. And so I think what your question is asking, and we only have a short experience on this, is does Zoom make it harder to handle this kind of thing well? It certainly does. Does it make it impossible? It does not. And I'm working with a number of companies, as you know, in addition to my sort of academic capacity, I find myself practicing what I'm preaching in the real world. And so one of my clients over the last few weeks I've been talking to, and one of the things that he's impressed on me is that while Zoom obviously has a certain impersonalness to it, there are various ways in which leaders into these circumstances, including downsizing, can at least try to, if not compensate, in some cases even leverage that platform. First of all, even having a Zoom conversations like this are ways in which you can at least have a personal touch and be present and have conversations about these issues with your employees. So you still have a platform to be able to communicate. Communication is one of the key elements about it. Then you add the notion of compassion and authenticity. So with that communication, is there transparency of information? Are people being straight about what's happening? And many of you know that there have been studies that have been done that basically ask people when you would like to hear bad news. And most people would say, I'd like to hear it as soon as possible and with full honesty. When you ask executives, when do you think it's best to give people bad news? Their answer is later and as much as they can handle, and therefore not complete information. And I think the notion of honesty and transparency is an extremely important part of this and demonstrates a sort of understanding, if not compassion, towards people. You also have organizations which an executive should have a good understanding of where the networks are, where the opinion leaders are, and it may be important to talk to some key opinion leaders and let them also form a network of conversations and communication with other people. And so having more direct conversations with a smaller group that can in turn have a larger set of conversations, again, I think is a way to overcome the Zoom limitations. And finally, I think the basic notion is leaning in as a leader and realize in these times, there's no such thing as passive leadership or bystander leadership. That's why I say, is it rising to the occasion or are you failing miserably? So the ability to show that compassion, to show personal involvement is critical. And if I made my list of characteristics, and Nishant, maybe your question sort of speaks to that, I'd put transparency as number one. I put frequent and consistent communication as number two, both of which can be done through Zoom. Then I put role modeling. And a number of you in your comments here suggested, again, there are examples where partners or executives or founders are taking pay cuts or in some way sharing some of the pain and or obviously showing a tremendous amount of role modeling, whatever that behavior would be, whether it's wearing a mask or whether it's personally being involved in people's lives in a way that they hadn't before, but some way their personal time and energy is spent directly with people. And what you said, Nishant, finally about compassion, showing compassion. No one as a leader can exhibit good leadership in this situation without having the ability to have some empathy, some EQ, some understanding of what people are going through. Doesn't mean that you can say, I know how you feel. You may not know how other people feel. What you can say is you appreciate at least hearing how people feel, and that helps you imagine, if not appreciate better, what that is. Raul, you're talking about, again, being sort of a wartime CEO. This is a lot about being a wartime CEO. And one of the things that wartime CEOs also do is they don't overpromise. They don't overpromise. Nishant, I have a very bad example to share. Would this be a good time to share that?
Sure, Professor. I think it's very helpful to understand what we should do. That is something that we talked about a few minutes back. And it is also good to understand as to what is an absolute no-no in these kind of situations. This is a war situation. This is a crisis situation. What should we not go ahead and do?
Well, that is the perfect segue to giving an example that many of you probably have seen. Bird scooters. People who have done bird scooters. Okay, I see heads nodding. We know about bird scooters. Everybody knows the bird scooter sort of a platform. Bird scooters had their own sort of business model issues and whatever. But if you've seen the articles in the last week, they're headlined like this. It felt like a Black Mirror episode. the inside account of how Bird laid off 406 people in 2 minutes via a Zoom webinar. You can look it up for yourself and get the full detail. So I started to think about just sort of a quick summary of it, and and every bit of the article was so telling about what not to do. And so everything I just listed as the ingredients of what to do, they violated one after the other. I'm going to just highlight a few of these just to show you. Number one, they scheduled a Zoom call with everyone at 10:30 and kept people waiting. No one had any idea what the call was going to be about. You see in the middle there, the employees stared at a sparse slide with a dark gray background that only said COVID-19. And after 5 minutes of dead air, which seemed like an eternity, is what they're saying, a robotic sounding disembodied voice came on the line. All right. I don't have to have a poll on this. Everybody on this call knows not a good thing to do. So there's violation number one. Now the question is, okay, CEO, can't wait to hear. Let's hear the CEO. Is that the disembodied voice? Turns out, no, it's the woman began unidentified by saying this is a suboptimal way to deliver this message. Yes, very true. And then she said, COVID-19 has also had a massive impact on our business, one that's forced our leadership team and our board to make extremely difficult and painful decisions. One of those decisions is to eliminate a number of roles at the company. Unfortunately, your role is impacted by this decision. Now, that is honest, that is straight. It doesn't show much compassion, however, and it may or may not be the whole story. The scheduled half-hour meeting ended in 2 minutes. So you've got everybody very, very anxious and obviously at this point shocked, and it ends in 2 minutes. And the question was, where was this chief executive? Was Vanderson, or this much was clear, it was not the chief executive on the call. And by the way, then their MacBooks were cut off and their privileges were cut off. Then comes the chief executive, who says sparingly, we did not let employees go via pre-recording. Well, that was certainly a relief. They actually didn't do it by a pre-recording. It was via a live Zoom meeting, which wasn't ideal because we're all working from home. Video was turned off, which we thought was more humane. In retrospect, we should have made one-on-one calls to the hundreds impacted over the course of a few days. So there already begin to suggest how this obviously could have been done better. And by the way, when I give a dramatic example like this, and if we were in a sort of longer conversation session like this, you would all supplement these kinds of things. Twitter last year or the year before also fired people by essentially just cutting off their privileges to be on Twitter or something like that. Basically, these dramatic ways in which companies do this, as too many examples of worst practice I've seen over and over again. And look at the last one. Well, then now we get the lawyers involved. And then you get the lawyers. We purposely and intentionally did not have any video to protect privacy. And they have this sort of lawyer comment. If you see the impact of this, that's where I wanted to say, what happens when you do this badly? What are the costs of not doing it well? Well, they said, all right, it's more and more common today to lay off people through Zoom or some other way to do it. But you see the quote in the middle. Lots of companies have to lay people off right now. People will recognize the companies who did it well and the ones that didn't. I hope Bird is the one that is remembered as one who did it poorly. That's an employee talking about the brand value, the social capital that was totally eroded through the way in which this was handled. So these are moments for leaders and for companies that have a lasting legacy. And so my kind of advice when we get to these kinds of situations is pay me now or pay me later. If you do this badly, you will pay a price for a long time. If you invest the thoughtfulness and the artistry in doing this well, you will benefit for a long time. You will benefit in terms of your personal legacy as a leader. You will benefit in terms of the alignment between your behaviors and the corporate values. You will benefit in terms of the social capital generated towards the company. You will benefit in terms of bringing people back into the company later when things get back on course, if they presumably do or will. And so when I think about this Bird example, is it typical? Well, I haven't had a chance to do research. There was, however, an article that just came out that I commend in HBR called How to Manage Coronavirus Layoffs with Compassion, and in fact has many of the points I just made. First of all, actually even reconsidering whether layoffs are necessary. But then second point, showing compassion. Third point, asking help, doing this in a thoughtful way. Don't just sort of wing it at this point. Don't overcommit to people, make all sorts of promises you can't keep. Don't make this about you, the CEO. It's not about you. It's about the people who are having the shocking sort of impact on them. And these are good bits of counsel for people. Nishant, I'm going to stop there and let you maybe kind of take it another step, because I know where time is going by here. Does that hopefully answer the question about what worst practice and best practice looks like?
Right.
Actually, let me just add one more thing, Nishant, and then have you kind of come in. This is another list of steps for doing layoffs successfully and effectively. This came pre-corona. So this is not, as the previous slide, in the corona era, and yet it fits perfectly well. Communicate widely and often. That was not happening at Bird. Fill in the information gaps for your employees. They were totally in the dark. Give them the most pressing information first. Well, they did. They did that. Never delegate the pain. They delegated to an unidentified voice, and no one knew who it was. Deliver the message personally and respectfully. They did not do that. Provide supports. Not obvious they were doing that. Support survivors too, people who are going to remain. In many instances of companies, some are obviously laid off, some are remaining. The survivors are watching carefully how people are being managed through the layoffs, and their own kind of motivation, goodwill, and word of mouth about the company will depend upon how they view the way in which you, the leader, handled the other employees. And finally, that CEOs should play a major central role in this. Nishant, I'll turn back to you.
Professor, that was wonderful. Thank you for telling us about what Bird did and thinking about what can we do in this matter. I think there's a lot of interesting questions in the chat panel, which is kind of a segue into my next question, is that in all my years of experience, I don't think I've seen like a playbook by organization as to how to navigate in times of crisis. So some of these organizations may not, come out at the other end. And should companies like right now, or maybe beforehand itself, before the crisis hits, should they start thinking about of an employee relief fund so that they do not have to go ahead and lay off employees, as well as hire those employees when the business is back up and running again? Is that something that they should do, or is there any other ideas in the market that organizations can follow?
So let's not minimize the responsibility and burdens of a leader. It includes what the Business Roundtable talked about of taking many different stakeholders into account. But it also includes what you just said, which is you have to balance short-term and long-term. So you're not only balancing stakeholders, you're balancing sort of time frame and priorities associated with that. There is no doubt, we all are living in it, that short-term urgent priorities overtook most everything else in this last month or 5 weeks. And so we can't fault executives for understandably falling into a trap that almost inevitably happens even without sort of crisis conditions. And yet we praise executives who are able to balance the short term and the long term, and who understand that what you do to employees today affects, again, your social capital reputation for tomorrow. What you do for employees today and how you treat them, again, will affect their ability to be motivated, their ability to recommend people to the organization, et cetera. So I would say I'm adding here, I guess, a notion of asking yourself as a leader some questions about what you're doing to consider the long-term impacts of what you're doing. Were departing employees treated fairly with dignity and respect? Were they provided some agency in how this is going to unfold and some ability to influence the outcomes themselves? And did the company, in fact, make a good faith effort to support them? If those questions can be answered affirmatively, the likelihood is you'll be able to continue to retain many of those employees to come back long-term. It doesn't mean that people won't shop for other jobs. It doesn't mean that life circumstances will change and some people won't come back. Obviously, the goal of companies is to retain their best employees. And so the attention of these kinds of questions or issues to best employees seems to me to be critical. Again, we don't have a lot of research yet, but I did a quick scan of companies and what they are doing. And what's interesting, I headed this, here's a sampling of COVID layoff announcements, which I think have very different implications for how people are going to think about long-term commitment or loyalty to the company. Sephora says, it's our sincerest hope we're able to bring these employees back on staff in the near future. So they explicitly spoke to your question, Nishant. JCPenney says, we are in fact furloughing a significant portion. If Zach Lopez is listening to this, I'm sorry, he's a JCPenney fan. Boeing made it a voluntary layoff plan. Tesla only furloughed non-essential workers and gave people pay cuts so that, again, jobs could be retained even if there was a pay cut that people had to bear. Under Armour said it was a temporary layoff. The Wing said they themselves as founders were going to forego their salaries, and Hearst, in a business that has no basis of any hopeful future in sort of media, in fact, made a commitment saying no furloughs and no pay cuts. So these companies express very different attitudes and messages about the future and about the kind of values that they were embodying. And I see Hitendra Wadhwa on this call. Hitendra and I both, are strong believers in personal beliefs and the ability to kind of live your words. And I think this is an example of companies, if they were preaching various kinds of values, they need to be able to practice those. And this becomes a test of that. And the other thing I guess I want to say about the long term is I did a quick scan of how many companies are setting up employee relief funds. Again, sending a message to people that they are willing and interested in supporting the communities and supporting employees. What you see there is 57% of companies are increasing their corporate philanthropy during this period. 43% are reallocating within their own existing budgets to put more priority on philanthropy. Of those companies that have an employee relief fund, 33% are expanding their funding guidelines, and 31% of companies who haven't had a fund are creating one. These, again, are statements of saying, while these are difficult times, there are key stakeholders we need to protect. And they include, of course, the shareholders. But again, given the Business Roundtable, they also are to include the communities and the employees themselves. Nishant, I hope that answered yours and other questions. I'm happy to hear.
Professor, that was an excellent answer, and we think we can see what the organizations are right now doing. I also believe that going forward, this will be an extensive requirement for companies to think of their employees beforehand itself, before they make their budgeting and planning. In retrospect, like, we are going to go out as MBAs into the job market within a year or within 2 years itself. We might have to go ahead and face those situations where we are either on the side where we have to take the decision of laying off employees, or maybe we might be on the other side as well. How do you think, what should we be taking back from this entire crisis as MBA students?
Well, I will be with a smile saying that in terms of the job market, I guess risk management jobs are probably very available these days, and a lot of interest in risk management. So you are entering into companies, those of you that are first years in a year and second years shortly, and alums like Jen Rhodes who are already there. Hello, Jen Rhodes. All of these kinds of circumstances are going to make companies' interest in paying attention to environmental scanning, contingency planning, risk planning, all of that much more important. That being said, go back to my early slides about VUCA and the world of sort of unpredictability. The reality is that all of you on this call either have or will face circumstances in which you're going to have to lay off people. It may not be because of a pandemic. It may not be because of some other kind of earth-shaking crisis. It may just be a function of sort of the business. And I receive emails from alums all the time, and they ask me questions. And I received this email that I found to be very telling, that in a way is I think can help answer your question, Nishant. I started a company with some CBS friends. The company grew to 75 people, all of them carefully chosen and nurtured by us. However, a change in the market environment brought hardships upon our company. I need to let go of 20 employees and shut down one office. How should I do it? And when I raise this in my classes, the initial reaction is, yeah, I guess I could handle that. And I said, well, let's talk specifically. So how should you do it? And we discover, of course, that no one is well prepared for this. And the best image we come up with is, well, did everybody see Up in the Air? And didn't we see George Clooney go out and sort of have conversations with people? And, oh, how did those look? And the answer was not so good. not so good. Delegating this to a third-party firm or to the lawyers or whatever doesn't really fit my criteria for how to do this. So, Nishant, I'm answering your question by basically validating its premise, which is that what we're experiencing today with the pandemic is the most dramatic version of what will be part of everyday business, which is that businesses ebb and flow and there are cycles. Today's being at a level of magnitude we've never seen before. And that often MBAs are very fertile ground for assigning the responsibility of doing something like the layoffs. In this example, it was a founder having to do it. That's one version of it. But you can be a middle manager and be asked to do it. And I think doing it is very different than textbook learning about it. And when we are looking at what Bird did, let's assume for the moment there were intelligent people running Bird. It seemed to be an interesting business model, have some possibility, and yet the way in which they handled it was terrible, was just terrible. And so we have to say to ourselves, this is going to take some preparation, some mentoring, some support from people, some classes on org change, shameless plug. Various ways in which this kind of work is not something that's just common sense. Is it common sense to lay somebody off on a Friday or a Monday? I think Friday, 50%. I think Monday, 50%. Is it good to say to somebody, I feel your pain? Well, that feels like that's very emotionally sensitive. Yes, but nobody can feel somebody else's pain. And so there are many different aspects of how to have these conversations or do this work that are not common sense. And it takes some investigation and discovery work about best practices. Certainly reading up on it is helpful, but also asking mentors, finding other people that have been through this, and understanding again that a lot of companies mishandle this, as many of your chat box comments suggested in this circumstance, but even in regular circumstances. So there is a lot to learn about this. And I'm leaving you, I guess, as we get close to the end of our session, with three important underscoring points. One is that whatever happens, somebody, and if it ends up being you, has to be able to explain to people what is behind all this, why has all this occurred, and why that leaves somebody impacted in the way in which a layoff would do so. Employees want to hear the truth. I said that before. They'd like to hear it from their bosses. It may not have to be the CEO, but from their bosses. And they want to be able to ask questions. Second of all, Professor Joel Brockner has got this wonderful book about fairness and an article in HBR about justice and fairness. And it's a reminder again that how you go about doing this, you don't leave people 5 minutes, 8 minutes in a room looking at a blank screen that says COVID-19. That's going to leave people in a very, very bad state of mind as it started at Bird. So the sense of, did they handle it well? Did they give us fair notice? Did they treat us as adults? Everybody is judging that. Even though the outcome may be highly unpleasant, losing a job, people again give high marks if the way in which it was handled was at least seen to be fair. And finally, giving people some agency. Again, we as MBAs can be very good at the Excel spreadsheets and identifying who are the numbers of people that need to go, the names of people that need to go. But those names and those numbers, in the end, are human beings that are going to be highly shocked and impacted. And the ability to give people some degree of agency, even if the final outcome is the same, but when they can collect their things or who they can speak to. In fact, I think I skipped a slide or skipped a paragraph in the Bird thing. And one of the things that people did is they shut off again their access to their computers, and people couldn't find each other and wanted to contact each other. And of course, they could figure it out when they got home in some other way. But the notion was the ability to give people some personal control over some of these circumstances is critical. So I have one last slide, Nishant, but I want to leave time here for any final questions. I guess we've got a few minutes left.
Professor, this is wonderful. I think this takes me back to my own experience as well, where one team was not fairly represented in the entire layoff process, and our boss had come out basically saying they were doing the same thing. They were taking off laptops, they were taking off Blackberries, and our boss had come out saying to the upper management, that if you've gotten these guys with respect within the organization, you let them out with respect. And I think your slide kind of plays onto it. Like, what is procedural justice? The institution of fairness that should be instilled in people who are being let go, and that will also help out people with who want to stay back within the organization as well.
And,
I think
Nishant,
that's one.
Yeah, to me, that raises a very important issue. You've used words and I've used words that might make some of us listening to this think that we were at a social work school, not a business school. Compassion and empathy and inclusion and various other kind of words like that. And I want to underscore the point that we are not using these words in and of themselves from a exclusive humanistic viewpoint, but rather to say it's pragmatic. That by having that degree of agency or some inclusion and showing compassion, you in fact will get better business outcomes. The survivors will work in a more motivated way. The brand equity of the company will be preserved, the social kind of goodwill associated with it. The ability for someone to come back to the company and want to come back to the company and work even harder. In the case of this client of mine that I've been speaking to and sort of counseling through this period, one of the things they did is an employee engagement survey to see how people are responding to these circumstances. And these very elements that are on this slide came through in all respects. They felt like they were communicated to and respected to understand what's going on in the fullness of what it was known and what was unknown. They felt like, again, they were regularly communicated to in a way that they felt they understood what was happening and they were considered to be sort of respected partners. And their only grouse was, gee, at work, these were not layoffs. These were people who were working from home. At work, we have 2 monitors. At home, I only have 1. If that's the only grouse you have from employees, and other than that, they feel like the company is doing well by them, is respectful of them, is showing dignity towards them, and to those that are going to be laid off, that's worth its weight in gold in the future. And that's, I mean, maybe again, at least for me, Nishant, I come back to the slide I created for today to say that this, in fact, is a moment in which leaders of companies you all are working in, have worked in, will work in, are being tested. Again, they will rise to this occasion or not. No one anticipated this crisis. No one wanted this crisis. And the complexity of this crisis and the uncertainties associated with it, if not unprecedented, are close to unprecedented. And what I want to, at least from my standpoint, leave you with is sort of as a hopeful message is I do think this will show us leadership mettle. Leadership mettle means this will show us where people can, in fact, find the qualities and the skills and dig deeper to be able to evidence to the organization why leadership matters. Why leadership matters. And at a time like this, it matters tremendously. And we at Columbia Business School are very proud of the fact that we are building a cadre of leaders for the future, but a cadre of leaders for the future with values and with the ability to anchor their behaviors in a variety of stakeholder lenses, a variety of time frames of short-term and long-term, a variety of pragmatic decisions. The business is not here, the customers are not here, we have to cut costs, we have to cut people. But the way in which you cut people, the way in which you handle them will make a big difference to the actual future success of the business. And I'm always impressed when I see a leader do it well. And many of you know I'm always depressed when I see examples like Bird, or many of them I'm sure you would share with me, that you would say, scratching your head, really? Is that the best that they could do? And you know, even at, I mean, I do this every year in my course. I ask about downsizing experiences. Everybody is, average age 28, 29, and you've been scarred before you even got to CBS with experiences that basically make you cynical and skeptical about organizations. They weren't honest. They didn't communicate. It was the first I heard when I read it in the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, et cetera. These stories that basically say they weren't following any of Jick's principles here. So I hope and trust that these have been useful to you. And Nishant, again, I want to commend you for organizing this and commend and thank everybody, all of you that participated in this. If you're in New York, it's a terrible, rainy, stormy day, and that's sort of symbolic of this subject matter. But you know that I wouldn't be doing this for 40 years if I didn't strongly believe that leadership can rise in times of change and make a difference. This puts them to the test in a way that perhaps never before has been done. But when Nishant asked me to do this, I said, I know I can come up with something. I want us to be hopeful, and that's how I'm hopefully leaving it with all of you.
So thank you. I think the last line, what you said about leadership can rise up in terms of this crisis and the crisis that follows. Uh, we are very happy to have you here. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Bernstein Center at Columbia Business School, I want to go ahead and thank everyone who joined us today and Professor Jick, who helped us dive deeper into the leadership challenges and guide us in these times. Can we have a virtual round of applause for Professor Jick here? And
I have many friends and family on this in this group. I want to thank all the friends who don't know. Delight to meet you even remotely. Look forward to a face-to-face meeting when we can.